The Rothschilds get all the attention, but there was another Jewish banking family that shaped the 20th century in ways most people can't imagine. During World War I, Max Warburg was financing the German war machine. His brother Paul had just created the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. Another brother was advising the British government. 3 brothers, 3 enemy nations, 1 family, 17 million dead. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented history. The Warburgs didn't just profit from World War I, they designed the financial architecture that made it possible. And then they did it again for World War II. When the smoke cleared, they were richer than ever, and the world was changed forever. This is the story of the most powerful family you've never heard of. And I promise you, the truth is stranger than any conspiracy. If you want to understand how money really controls history, hit subscribe now, because this story goes places no one expects. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this family's reach touched every continent. Before they financed world wars, the Warburgs could not even choose their own last name. In 1559, a Jewish merchant named Simon von Kassel was forced to flee his home in the German town of Warburg. The authorities had expelled the Jews again, as they did periodically throughout medieval Europe, and Simon needed a new identity in a new place. The decree required Jews to adopt fixed surnames for tax purposes and easier tracking. Simon chose the name of the town he was leaving behind, Warburg. It was not a choice made from sentiment, it was survival. The family seal he adopted told the story more honestly than any name could. A ship sailing on waves, commerce and survival, movement and adaptation. That seal would appear on documents that decided the fate of nations. But in 1559 it was just a symbol of hope that this family might find somewhere safe to exist. The Warburgs spent the next 2 centuries living in the margins of German society. They resided in ghettos, those walled sections of cities where Jews were legally required to live. The gates locked at night, special taxes applied to everything. Jews needed permits to travel, permits to marry, permits to have children beyond a certain number. The restrictions were designed to keep the Jewish population small, poor, and dependent on the tolerance of local rulers. But within these constraints, the Warburgs discovered something that would define their family for generations. Christians in medieval Europe were forbidden by church law from charging interest on loans. The sin of usury could condemn your soul to hell. But commerce required credit. Trade required financing. Princes needed money for wars, merchants needed money for inventory. And farmers needed money to survive until harvest. Someone had to provide the loans that made the economy function. That someone was the Jews. The Warburgs became what the Germans called Schutzjuden, protected Jews. This meant they served the local nobility as financial agents in exchange for the right to exist. They collected taxes, managed estates, provided loans, and handled the money that Christian nobles found distasteful to touch directly. It was a precarious position. Useful enough to be tolerated, visible enough to be blamed when things went wrong. When princes could not pay their debts, the solution was often simple. Expel the Jews, cancel the obligations, seize their property. The Warburgs learned to keep assets mobile, to maintain relationships across borders, to never trust that today's safety would last until tomorrow. There is a family legend that traces the Warburg banking tradition even further back to Venice in the 1500s. The Del Banco family were prominent Jewish bankers in the Venetian Republic. Del Banco literally means of the bank in Italian. Some genealogists have attempted to connect the Warburgs to this Venetian line, suggesting that banking was in their blood for half a millennium. The documented evidence is thin. What is certain is that the Warburgs cultivated this connection, this sense of ancient lineage in finance. Whether or not the Venice story is literally true, it became part of how the family understood itself. They were not newcomers to money, they were inheritors of a tradition that stretched back centuries. By the 18th century, the Warburg family had established a more stable existence in the German estates. They were still restricted, still taxed, still vulnerable to the whims of local rulers. But they had accumulated enough capital and enough connections to operate as serious financial intermediaries. The family tradition required sons to begin learning the banking business at age 12. Not theory, practice. They would work in the counting houses, learn the ledgers, understand how credit flowed across borders. By the time a Warburg son reached adulthood, he had spent a decade mastering the family trade. Then came the breakthrough. Moses Marcus Warburg was born in 1763 at a time when European Jews were beginning to see cracks in the walls that had confined them for centuries. The Enlightenment was spreading ideas about reason, tolerance, and individual rights. Some German states were beginning to relax the most oppressive restrictions. Hamburg in particular offered possibilities that did not exist elsewhere. Hamburg was a free city, an independent republic within the German lands. It had a long tradition of trade, a massive port, and a practical tolerance for anyone who could contribute to commerce. The city was not exactly welcoming to Jews. They still could not become citizens, still faced restrictions. But Hamburg needed financiers who could handle international trade, who could issue letters of credit that would be honoured in London, in Amsterdam, in Venice. Moses Marcus Warburg saw the opportunity. In 1798, while Napoleon was conquering Egypt and revolutionaries were reshaping France, Moses Marcus founded M.M. Warburg & Co. in Hamburg. The timing was either brilliant or lucky, or both. The old European order was collapsing. The Napoleonic Wars would redraw every border on the continent. Fortunes would be destroyed overnight. But war also creates opportunity for those who can move money across battle lines, who can finance the arms and supplies that armies need, who can provide credit when governments run out of gold. M.M. Warburg specialised in international trade finance. When a Hamburg merchant wanted to import goods from England, the Warburgs would issue a letter of credit that an English bank would honour. When a manufacturer needed to export machinery to Russia, the Warburgs would handle the complex currency exchanges and payment guarantees. They became the lubricant that made international commerce possible. Hamburg was their gateway to the world, and they positioned themselves at the gate. The Warburgs were not trying to become the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds were flashy, famous, politically connected at the highest levels. They financed governments openly, consorted with kings, built palaces. The Warburgs were more discreet. They were German in their manners and their identity. They did not seek the spotlight. They built relationships quietly, accumulated influence gradually, and never forgot that Jewish prominence in finance had historically ended with expulsion or worse. But the Warburgs did connect to the Rothschild network. They became junior partners, correspondents, part of the web of Jewish banking families that spanned Europe. These connections were reinforced through marriage. A Warburg daughter might marry a son from the Oppenheim banking family. A Warburg son might wed into the Schiff or Loeb clans. Each marriage created new business relationships, new lines of credit, new sources of information. The family was itself a financial institution, its bloodlines serving as contracts more binding than any legal document. By the mid-19th century, M.M. Warburg had become one of the most important private banks in Germany. They survived the revolutions of 1848, the financial panics that destroyed weaker competitors, the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. They adapted to each new political reality while maintaining their core business. Then came the generation that would transform the Warburgs from successful regional bankers into a global force. Moritz Warburg, who ran the bank in the late 19th century, had 5 sons. 5 sons who would scatter across the world and position the family at the centre of events that would shape the 20th century. The eldest was Abi Warburg, born in 1866. Abi had no interest in banking. He was consumed by art, by history, by the psychological power of images. According to family legend, at age 13, Abi made a deal with his younger brother Max. Abi would surrender his birthright as the eldest son, his right to lead the family bank, in exchange for one thing. Max would agree to buy Abi any book he ever wanted for the rest of his life. Max agreed. It was the most expensive promise in the family's history. Abi went on to found the Warburg Institute, one of the most important centres for art historical research in the world. His library would grow to over 60,000 volumes. But more importantly for our story, his decision opened the path for Max. Max Warburg, born in 1867, became the head of M.M. Warburg. He would transform the Hamburg Bank into a central node in German finance, advise the Kaiser, help finance the German war machine, and face impossible choices when the Nazis came to power. Paul Warburg, born in 1868, would emigrate to America and help create the Federal Reserve, the most powerful financial institution on earth. His fingerprints are still on American monetary policy today. Felix Warburg, born in 1871, would also go to America, marry into the Schiff banking dynasty, and become one of the most important philanthropists and Jewish community leaders in American history. Fritz Warburg, born in 1879, would remain in Hamburg, working alongside Max, maintaining the German operations while his brothers conquered new territories. 5 brothers, 3 countries, 1 family. They maintained constant communication, sharing information about markets and politics and opportunities. They visited each other regularly, coordinated their activities, saw themselves as a single enterprise operating across national boundaries. In an era before telephones were common, before instant communication, the Warburg network was a competitive advantage that few could match. By 1890, Warburg & Co. managed assets worth approximately 150 million marks. In today's money, that is roughly $2.3 billion. The family had survived 14 different rulers, 6 major wars, and 3 attempts at complete expulsion from German territories. They had been banking for 91 years without interruption, through Napoleon his conquest, through revolutions, through financial panics that destroyed hundreds of competitors. They had gone from choosing a surname under duress to advising the German imperial government, from ghetto restrictions to the highest levels of European finance. But creating a dynasty was the easy part. The Warburgs were about to face tests that would make their previous struggles look simple. Because the 20th century was coming, and with it would come wars that dwarfed anything in human history, political movements that targeted Jews for extermination, and impossible choices that would force the Warburg brothers to decide what mattered more, their nations or their blood. What came next would determine whether any fortune, any family, any amount of influence could survive a world determined to tear itself apart. And if you want to understand how money really shapes history, hit subscribe now because this story is about to get much darker. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because the Warburg reach extended to every corner of the globe. Chapter 2: When Traditional Banking Met Industrial Ambition. Max Warburg was not supposed to be a banker. He wanted to be an artist. His father had other plans. This tension between personal desire and family duty would define not only Max's life but the fate of his entire dynasty. Born in 1807, in Hamburg, Max was the second of 7 children of Moritz Warburg, the man who transformed Warburg from a modest regional firm into one of Europe's most influential private banks. Moritz believed in duty above all else. He believed that the Warburg sons existed to serve the family enterprise, that personal ambitions were luxuries the family could not afford, that every generation owed its labour to the generations that came before and the generations yet to come. Max's older brother Abi had already escaped. Abi was brilliant but unstable, prone to fits of obsessive research and periods of deep melancholy. He made a deal with Max when they were both young. Abi would renounce his birthright as eldest son, surrendering his claim to leadership of the family bank in exchange for one thing: books, as many books as he wanted, forever paid for by the family. Max agreed. It seemed like a good bargain at the time. Abi went on to amass one of the greatest private libraries in Europe and founded what would become the Warburg Institute, a centre for art historical research that still operates in London today. He spent his life studying how images carry meaning across cultures and centuries, tracing the survival of ancient symbols into modern times. He suffered a complete mental breakdown after World War I and spent years in a sanatorium. He never ran a bank. He never advised a Kaiser. He never had to choose between his country and his people. Max did not have that luxury. With Abi's abdication, Max became the heir apparent. His father put him to work immediately. Max learned the family business from the ground up, from the counting rooms where clerks recorded transactions in ledgers with steel-nib pens, to the private offices where deals worth millions were concluded with a handshake and a glass of port. He learned that banking was not about money. Money was simply the medium. Banking was about trust, information, and relationships. A Warburg's word was his bond, and that bond was worth more than any contract because it carried the weight of generations. Max proved unexpectedly brilliant at the work he had never wanted. He had his father's head for numbers, but also something Moritz lacked: charm. Max could walk into a room of industrialists and aristocrats and make each one feel like the most important person present. He remembered names, remembered children's birthdays, remembered the small details that make people feel seen and valued. He told jokes. He listened more than he talked. He made friends everywhere he went, and in banking, friends are the only currency that truly matters. By his late 20s, Max had become the public face of Warburg. His father still made the major decisions, but Max handled the relationships, and the most important relationship of all was with the German Kaiser himself. Wilhelm II was a complicated man ruling a complicated empire. Germany had unified only in 1871, and the new nation was still finding its identity. Wilhelm wanted Germany to be a world power, to rival Britain on the seas and France in culture and everyone everywhere in industrial might. He was brilliant and erratic, capable of great vision and petty cruelty, convinced of his own destiny and terrified of inadequacy. He was also, like most European aristocrats of his era, casually anti-Semitic. Wilhelm made jokes about Jews at dinner parties. He blamed Jewish newspapers for criticizing his policies. He suspected Jewish bankers of caring more about profit than patriotism, and yet he needed those bankers desperately because the German Empire was expensive to run. This was the contradiction that defined Jewish life in Imperial Germany. Jews were simultaneously essential and despised, welcomed into the highest circles of commerce and excluded from the highest circles of society, praised for their contributions to German greatness, and blamed for anything that went wrong. Max Warburg navigated this impossible terrain with extraordinary skill. He presented himself as German first and Jewish second, or perhaps third or fourth. He spoke perfect aristocratic German. He dressed like a Prussian gentleman. He served his country with visible devotion. He made his Jewishness so unobtrusive, so unremarkable, that people could almost forget it was there. Almost. Max once said something that would later haunt him. "I am a German of Jewish faith, not a Jewish German." He meant it as a declaration of patriotic loyalty. He was German in culture, in language, in values, in everything that mattered. His religion was a private matter, a family tradition, not a defining identity. He loved Germany. He believed in Germany. He would serve Germany until the day he died. What Max did not understand, what none of the assimilated German Jews of his generation understood, was that it did not matter how German they felt, it only mattered how German others perceived them. And when the crisis came, when Germany needed someone to blame, no amount of patriotism would save them. But that crisis was decades away. In the 1890s and 1900s, Max Warburg was rising, and Germany was rising with him. The Warburgs became essential to the German imperial project in several ways. First and most importantly, they financed German shipping. Hamburg was Germany's window to the world, and the Hamburg and America line was the largest shipping company on Earth. At its peak, the line operated 172 vessels, more than the entire British Royal Navy had ships. These were not small coastal traders. They were massive ocean liners that carried millions of emerald croquettes from Europe to America. That transported German-manufactured goods to every port on the planet, that projected German power across the seas. The Warburgs did not own the Hamburg-America line. Albert Berlin, another German Jew, ran the company. But the Warburgs financed its operations, arranged its credit, handled its international currency transactions. When the Hamburg-America line needed to pay a supplier in Buenos Aires or collect a debt in Singapore, M.M. Warburg made it happen. This was the invisible infrastructure of global trade, the financial plumbing that made commerce possible, and the Warburgs controlled a crucial section of the pipe. Second, the Warburgs financed German colonial ventures. Germany had come late to the imperial game, but Wilhelm II was determined to catch up. German colonies in Africa, in China, in the Pacific all required capital, and private banks like Warburg provided it. The official government could not be seen directly financing ventures that might fail or might require actions that would embarrass the empire in international opinion. Private bankers provided deniability. They also provided expertise. The Warburgs knew Africa. They had correspondents in Cape Town and Cairo, in Lagos and Lorenzo Marques. They knew which local officials could be bribed and which could not, which trading companies were reliable and which were fronts for swindlers, which investments would pay and which would fail. This knowledge was worth as much as the money itself. Third and most broadly, the Warburgs financed German industrialization. Germany was transforming from an agricultural backwater into an industrial powerhouse, and that transformation required staggering amounts of capital. New factories, new railways, new mines, new technologies, all of it needed money. The great German industrial companies, Krupp and Thyssen and AEG, all had relationships with the Warburg Bank. Max sat on corporate boards. He advised on mergers and acquisitions. He helped German industry access international capital markets. When a German steel company wanted to expand, when a German chemical firm wanted to acquire a competitor, when a German electrical manufacturer wanted to build a new plant, they came to Hamburg. They came to Max. This was the source of Max Warburg's power and the source of his danger. He knew too much. He knew which companies were thriving and which were struggling. He knew which government officials were honest and which were taking bribes. He knew which aristocratic families were secretly broke and which were quietly building fortunes. He knew what the Kaiser was planning before the Kaiser's own ministers knew. He knew because banking is an information business. Money flows toward knowledge and away from ignorance. The Warburgs had spent generations building an information network that spanned the globe. Their correspondents in 300 banks across 40 countries reported not just on financial conditions, but on political developments, on social unrest, on technological innovations, on anything that might affect the value of an investment. A Warburg in Hamburg might learn of a revolution in South America or a famine in Asia weeks before the German government received official reports. This information advantage was the real Warburg secret, not conspiracy, not manipulation, just knowing things before everyone else knew them and acting on that knowledge with speed and precision. Governments needed bankers like the Warburgs for exactly this reason. Official channels were slow, bureaucratic, constrained by protocol and precedent. Private bankers could move fast, they could be discreet, they could do things that governments could not officially do. When the Kaiser wanted to send a message to a foreign power, without going through diplomatic channels, he might use a banker as intermediary. When the government wanted to finance something that could not appear in the official budget, private banks could arrange the credit. This is why Max Warburg had access to the Kaiser, why he dined with chancellors, why foreign ministers sought his advice. He was useful, and in the brutal calculus of power, usefulness is the only protection. But Max's ambitions extended beyond Germany. The Warburg family had never been content with a single market. From their earliest days in the Hamburg ghetto, they had cultivated connections across Europe and beyond, and in the 1890s, those connections led them to America. Jakob Schiff was the key. Born in Frankfurt in 1847, Schiff had emigrated to America after the Civil War and risen to become the head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the only investment bank that could rival the mighty J.P. Morgan. Schiff was brilliant, driven, and deeply conscious of his Jewish identity in ways that Max Warburg was not. He funded Jewish charities and Jewish settlements in Palestine. He fought against anti-Semitism wherever he found it. He famously helped finance Japan's war against Russia in 2004, partly because he wanted to punish the Tsar for tolerating pogroms against Russian Jews. Schiff was connected to the Warburgs through marriage. Max's cousin Nina had married Paul Warburg, and Paul worked at Kuhn Loeb in New York. This was not coincidence. Jewish banking families intermarried constantly, weaving a web of kinship that crossed national borders and made family interests synonymous with business interest. When you did business with one Warburg, you did business with all of them. Schiff saw opportunity in this arrangement. America was growing explosively, but its financial system was primitive, prone to regular panics that wiped out savings and destroyed businesses. Schiff believed that America needed a central bank like the ones that stabilized European economies. He believed that the right person could help create such a bank. He believed that person was Paul Warburg. Paul was the intellectual of the Warburg brothers. Where Max was charming and practical, Paul was scholarly and idealistic. He had studied banking systems across Europe. He had written papers on monetary policy. He understood, as few Americans did, how a properly designed central bank could smooth out the boom and bust cycles that plagued the American economy. Schiff brought Paul to New York in 1902. The plan was simple in outline and staggering in ambition. Paul would use his expertise and Schiff's connections to reshape American finance. He would bring European sophistication to American chaos. He would make the Warburg name as powerful in New York as it was in Hamburg. The 5 Warburg brothers understood what was happening. They had an implicit compact, never written down but universally honoured. Each brother would serve the family from his own position. Max would run Hamburg. Paul would conquer New York. Felix, who had also married into the Schiff family, would manage philanthropy and social position. The younger brothers would find their own niches. They would share information across borders. They would help each other's enterprises. They would put family above country, blood above flag, the Warburg name above any national loyalty. This was not conspiracy. This was simply how international banking families operated. The Rothschilds had done it for generations. The Warburgs were following a proven model. But it meant that the Warburgs in Germany and the Warburgs in America were not truly German or American. They were Warburgs first. In times of peace, this distinction did not matter. In times of war, it would matter enormously. By 1910, Warburg and Company had direct relationships with over 300 banks across 40 countries. They handled an estimated 40% of Hamburg's import and export financing. Max Warburg personally knew the Kaiser, the Chancellor, 3 foreign ministers, and the heads of Germany's 5 largest industrial corporations. The Hamburg-America line, which the Warburgs helped finance, operated 172 ships, more than the entire British Royal Navy had vessels. German trade was exploding and the Warburgs were at the centre of it all. Max had achieved everything his father could have wanted. He had made the family bank indispensable to the German Empire. He had cultivated relationships with the most powerful people in Europe. He had positioned the Warburgs to profit from German greatness and to suffer from German failure. He was, in the language of his time, a success. He had no idea what was coming. Across the Atlantic, his brother Paul was looking at the American financial system and seeing chaos. Bank panics struck regularly, wiping out savings and plunging the economy into depression. There was no central authority to stabilize credit, no lender of last resort, no coordination among the thousands of independent banks that held the nation's money. America was a financial primitive, a great industrial power with the banking system of a frontier town. Paul Warburg believed he could fix it. He believed he could bring order to chaos, stability to panic, European sophistication to American wildness. He believed that if he could just get the right people in a room, he could design a system that would serve America for generations. He had no idea that his creation would become the most controversial institution in American history. He had no idea that his name would become synonymous with conspiracy, that millions of people would believe he had designed a secret system to enslave the American people through debt. He had no idea that the system he built to prevent panics would one day be blamed for causing them. When Paul Warburg arrived in New York in 1902, he found a financial system that horrified him. What he did about it would change America forever and make the Warburg name a synonym for conspiracy. But that is a story for the next chapter. Chapter 3: American Infiltration. When Paul Warburg stepped off the ship in New York Harbor in 1902, he was appalled by what he saw. America had no central bank, no coordinated financial system. It was, in his words, a financial savage. Paul Warburg was not like his brother Max. Where Max was a charming dealmaker comfortable in the halls of German power, Paul was a theorist, a planner, a man who saw systems where others saw chaos. Born in 1868, the youngest of the Warburg brothers destined for banking, Paul had spent his formative years studying the great central banks of Europe, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Banque de France. He understood how modern financial systems were supposed to work, and when he arrived in America, he was genuinely horrified by what he found. Officially, Paul came to America for love. He had married Nina Loeb, daughter of Solomon Loeb, one of the founding partners of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the second most powerful investment bank in America after J.P. Morgan. The marriage was strategic in the way all banking marriages were strategic. It connected the Warburg dynasty of Hamburg to the Jewish banking elite of New York. It gave Paul an instant position at one of America's most influential financial institutions. But Paul quickly realized he had stumbled into something bigger than a business opportunity. He had found a mission. You need to understand what American banking looked like in 1902 to appreciate Paul's shock. There was no central coordinating authority, no lender of last resort, no unified currency system. America had over 7,000 independent banks, each issuing its own notes, each operating under different state regulations, each vulnerable to panics that could spread like wildfire through an uncoordinated system. The country had suffered major financial panics in 1873, 1884, 1893, and would suffer the worst of all in 1907. Every other major industrial nation had solved this problem decades earlier by establishing central banks. America, uniquely among developed nations, refused. The reason was historical and ideological. Americans hated central banks. Andrew Jackson had destroyed the second bank of the United States in the 1830s, calling it a monster of corruption that served wealthy elites at the expense of common people. That view had hardened into political orthodoxy. Central bank meant Eastern bankers controlling Western farmers. Central bank meant Wall Street tyranny. Central bank meant un-American concentration of power. Any politician who proposed a central bank was committing career suicide. Paul saw this differently. He saw a financial system that was an accident waiting to happen. He saw panics that wiped out savings, destroyed businesses, threw millions into unemployment, all because there was no coordinating mechanism to provide liquidity during crises. He saw American farmers unable to get credit when they needed it, because the money supply could not expand to meet seasonal demands. He saw a system where one bad bank could trigger a chain reaction that brought down hundreds of healthy banks. And he saw an opportunity. If he could design a central bank that Americans would accept, if he could wrap the necessary functions in language and structure that avoided the toxic central bank label, he could reshape American finance. The Warburg family would benefit enormously from a stable American financial system, but so would America. This is where the conspiracy narrative begins, and this is where we need to be careful about separating documented history from paranoid fantasy. Conspiracy theorists claim Paul Warburg was sent to America specifically to capture its financial system for European banking interests, that his marriage was a cover for infiltration, that he was an agent of the Rothschilds or some shadowy international banking cabal. The documented history is different, but almost as remarkable. Paul came for marriage. He stayed because he recognized America's financial weaknesses as both genuinely dangerous and a genuine opportunity. His campaign for banking reform absolutely aligned with his family's interests. Warburg banks would benefit from a stable American system that could serve as a reliable partner in international finance. But the reforms he proposed also addressed real systemic problems that had caused real suffering for millions of Americans. Was it self-interested reform or public-spirited conspiracy? The honest answer is that the line between those two things is blurrier than either side wants to admit. Paul spent his first years in America learning. He studied American banking laws, American political culture, American fears about concentrated financial power. He was building a case, and he was smart enough to know that the case had to be made carefully. He began writing articles for financial journals and newspapers, explaining how European central banks worked. Describing their benefits in stabilizing economies and preventing panics, he was careful never to use the word central bank. Instead, he talked about reserve associations and banking reform and monetary stability. He was educating America, and he was doing it with the patience of a man who understood that real change takes time. Then came 1907. The Panic of 1907 was exactly the catastrophe Paul had been warning about. It started with a failed attempt to corner the copper market. When the scheme collapsed, it triggered runs on banks associated with the speculators. The runs spread. Bank after bank failed. The stock market crashed, losing 50% of its value from the previous year's peak. Credit froze. Businesses that depended on short-term loans to operate found themselves unable to function. Factories closed. Workers were laid off. Unemployment jumped from 2.8% to 8% in months. The entire American financial system teetered on the edge of complete collapse, and there was no central bank to stop it. What stopped it was one man. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful private banker in America, personally organized a rescue. He summoned the presidents of New York's major banks to his library. He locked the doors. He refused to let anyone leave until they agreed to contribute to a pool of funds that would prop up failing institutions. Morgan committed $35 million of his own fortune, equivalent to roughly $1.1 billion today. He strong-armed other bankers into contributing. He essentially became a one-man central bank, making lending decisions that determined which institutions would survive and which would fail. It worked. The panic subsided. The system stabilized. But everyone recognized that something was deeply wrong with a system where the financial fate of the entire nation depended on the willingness of one private citizen to intervene. Morgan was 70 years old. He would not live forever. And even if he did, should one unelected private banker have that kind of power? The Panic of 1907 transformed the political debate. Suddenly, banking reform was not career suicide but political necessity. Congress established the National Monetary Commission to study the banking systems of other nations and recommend reforms. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of the most powerful Republicans in Congress, was appointed to lead it, and Paul Warburg finally had his opening. Aldrich was an unlikely reformer. He was deeply conservative, closely connected to big business. Father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. He had no particular expertise in banking, but he was smart enough to recognize that he needed expertise, and Paul Warburg had spent 7 years positioning himself as America's foremost expert on central banking systems. The two men formed an alliance that would change American history. Paul essentially became the intellectual engine of the National Monetary Commission. He drafted memoranda explaining how European central banks worked. He proposed structures that might work in America. He educated Aldrich and other commission members on the technical details of monetary policy. He was the man with the plan, even if he was careful to let American politicians take public credit. The commission travelled to Europe, studying the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, the Banque de France. Paul knew these institutions intimately. He had family connections at all of them. He could explain not just how they worked officially, but how they actually operated in practice. He was invaluable, and Aldrich knew it. But reform was still politically treacherous. Democrats opposed anything that smelled of Wall Street influence. Progressive Republicans opposed anything that concentrated power in Eastern financial institutions. The National Monetary Commission produced a report, but legislation stalled. The country needed reform. Everyone agreed on that after 1907, but nobody could agree on what form reform should take. The political system was gridlocked. Meanwhile, Paul was building his power base at Kuhn Loeb. He had risen rapidly at the firm, becoming a full partner by 1903. The firm was a powerhouse, second only to J.P. Morgan in American investment banking. It had financed railroads, industrial consolidations, government bonds. Its senior partner, Jacob Schiff, was considered the most influential Jewish banker in America, a man whose opinion shaped markets and whose displeasure could sink deals. Paul's brother Felix had also joined Kuhn Loeb, marrying Frieda Schiff, Jacob's daughter. The Warburg brothers were now deeply embedded in American financial aristocracy. They attended the same parties as the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Carnegies. They summered in the same resorts, they served on the same boards. Within a decade of arriving as immigrants, they had become insiders at the highest levels of American finance. The panic of 1907 had caused $60 million in losses, bankrupted 43 major corporations, and pushed unemployment from 2.8% to 8%. The stock market dropped 50% from its peak. J.P. Morgan committed $35 million of his personal fortune, equivalent to $1.1 billion today, to prevent total collapse. Meanwhile, Paul Warburg's personal wealth was estimated at $8 million. His firm Kuhn Loeb managed over $500 million in assets, and the combined Warburg family banking operations across Germany, Britain, and America controlled access to capital worth billions. They were not just observers of the financial crisis, they were positioned to shape what came after, but political gridlock remained. The Aldrich Plan, which Paul had essentially designed, was dead on arrival once Democrats won the 1910 elections. Any proposal associated with Aldrich, associated with Wall Street, associated with the Republican establishment was politically toxic. The reformers needed a new approach. They needed something that could appear to come from outside the existing power structure while actually embodying all the technical features that Paul had designed. They needed a conspiracy. Not a conspiracy in the paranoid sense, a conspiracy in the literal sense. A secret agreement among powerful people to achieve a goal they could not achieve openly. Because in late 1910, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would give birth to the Federal Reserve, transform American finance forever, and fuel conspiracy theories for the next century. A group of the most powerful men in America would gather in secret on a private island. They would use fake names. They would travel in a private rail car with the blinds drawn. They would tell no one where they were going or what they were doing, and Paul Warburg would be in the room where it happened. What emerged from that island meeting would become the Federal Reserve System, the most powerful financial institution in America, perhaps in the world. And the secret circumstances of its creation would ensure that questions about its legitimacy, its purpose, and its true masters would never fully die. What happened next is the most controversial event in American financial history. A secret meeting on a private island that would give birth to the Federal Reserve, and Paul Warburg would be in the room where it happened. Chapter 4. The Secret Island Meeting that Created American Money. In November 1910, some of the most powerful men in America gathered at a remote island off the Georgia coast. They used fake names, they travelled in a private rail car with the blinds drawn. What they created would control the American economy for the next century. The journey began at a train station in Hoboken, New Jersey on a cold November evening. Senator Nelson Aldrich had arranged everything with meticulous care. The men arrived separately so nobody would notice that 6 of the most influential financiers in America were boarding the same private rail car. They had been instructed to use first names only. Some used false names entirely. Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, which would later become Citibank, went by his name Orville. Henry Davison, a senior partner at JP Morgan and Company, simply called himself Henry. Paul Warburg, the German-born banker from Kuhn-Loeb, used the name Paul as though he were merely a servant accompanying the wealthy men. The cover story, if anyone asked, was simple. They were going duck hunting, a group of wealthy friends enjoying a sporting holiday on a private island. The blinds of the railcar were drawn shut as they pulled out of the station. Nobody outside was permitted to see who was inside. The train travelled for 2 days, heading south along the Atlantic coast. The men slept in luxury compartments and dined together in a private car stocked with the finest food and wine. But they did not discuss the weather or hunting or politics. They discussed money. Specifically, they discussed how to redesign the entire American financial system from the ground up. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a barrier island off the coast of Georgia that most Americans had never heard of. The island was owned by the Jekyll Island Club, an exclusive retreat whose members included J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, William K. Vanderbilt, and Joseph Pulitzer. The combined wealth of the club members represented approximately 1/6 of the entire world's wealth at the time. Membership was by invitation only, and the waiting list stretched for years. The club had its own steamship to ferry members from the mainland. It had its own telegraph office, its own staff of servants and cooks and groundskeepers. It was as close to a private kingdom as existed in America. When the train arrived at the small station near Brunswick, Georgia, the men transferred to the club steamship and crossed the Sound to Jekyll Island. They were met by a skeleton crew of servants who had been carefully instructed to ask no questions and remember no faces. For the next 9 days, these 6 men, plus A. Piat Andrew, an assistant secretary of the Treasury, would remain on the island, working from morning until late at night, drafting what would become the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. You need to understand who was in that room, because the guest list alone explains why this meeting has fueled conspiracy theories for over a century. Senator Nelson Aldrich was the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate and chairman of the National Monetary Commission, which had been created after the Panic of 1907 to study banking reform. He was also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., making him intimately connected to the richest family in America. Frank Vanderlip ran National City Bank, the largest bank in America, and a cornerstone of the Rockefeller financial empire. Henry Davison was effectively the right hand of J.P. Morgan himself, representing the most powerful private banking house in the world. Charles Norton was president of the First National Bank of New York, another Morgan-aligned institution. Benjamin Strong was a rising executive at Bankers Trust who would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful position in the new system. A. Piat Andrew represented the Treasury Department, providing official government expertise. And then there was Paul Warburg. Paul was different from the others in almost every way. He was German-born Jewish, an immigrant who had only been in America for 8 years. He did not control a major bank. He was a partner at Kuhn-Loeb, but not its leader. He lacked the old money connections and the establishment credentials of his companions. But Paul had something none of them possessed. He understood how central banking actually worked. Paul had spent years studying the Bank of England, the Reichsbank in Germany, and the Banque de France. He had written extensively about the weaknesses of the American system and the strengths of European models. He understood reserve requirements and discount rates and lender of last resort functions in ways that the other men did not. While they brought power and connections and political influence, Paul brought the actual blueprint. He was the architect. The others were the builders. The work on Jekyll Island was intense and focused. Each morning the men would gather in the club's meeting room surrounded by papers and charts. Paul would explain concepts from European banking systems. The others would debate how to adapt these concepts for American political realities. The central problem they faced was this: America needed a central bank. The Panic of 1907 had proven that beyond any doubt. When a financial crisis hit, there was no institution capable of providing emergency lending to sound banks facing temporary liquidity problems. There was no coordination of the money supply, there was no lender of last resort. J.P. Morgan had personally stepped in during NIB 7 using his own fortune and his own judgment to decide which banks would survive and which would fail. That was insane. One private citizen, however wealthy, should not have the power to determine the fate of the entire economy. But Americans hated central banks. Andrew Jackson had destroyed the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s, and the political memory was long. Central banks were seen as tools of Eastern elites, instruments of concentrated power that would benefit Wall Street at the expense of farmers and workers and ordinary citizens. Any proposal that smelled like a central bank would be dead on arrival in Congress. So the Jekyll Island group had to solve an impossible problem: create a central bank that did not look like a central bank, give it the powers of central coordination without the appearance of central control, make it acceptable to populist Democrats in the South and West while actually serving the needs of Eastern financial interests. The solution they developed was brilliant in its deception. Instead of one central bank, they would create 12 regional reserve banks. Each region would have its own institution, seemingly independent and responsive to local needs. This decentralized structure would deflect accusations of Eastern domination. But here was the trick. The 12 regional banks would be coordinated by a central board in Washington. The regional banks would be owned by private member banks, not by the government. Bankers would essentially regulate themselves through a system they controlled. And the whole apparatus would have the power to create money to set interest rates and to serve as lender of last resort during financial crises. Paul Warburg was the intellectual engine driving these discussions. He drafted proposal after proposal, refining the structure based on feedback from the other men. They argued about representation on the central board, about how reserve requirements would work, about the relationship between the new system and the Treasury Department. But the core architecture remained Paul's. When one of the men later wrote about Jekyll Island, he noted that Warburg was tireless, working late into the night, drafting documents that the others would review the next morning. By the end of 9 days, they had produced a detailed plan. They called it the Aldrich Plan after the senator who would present it to Congress, but it should have been called the Warburg Plan. Every significant feature bore his fingerprints. Now here is where we need to address the conspiracy theories directly, because what happened at Jekyll Island has become one of the foundational texts of American conspiracy culture. The story goes like this. A secret cabal of bankers met in total secrecy to design a system that would allow them to control the American economy and enslave the American people through debt. The Federal Reserve they created is not a government institution, but a private bank owned by shadowy interests. It creates money out of thin air, enriching the banking class while impoverishing ordinary citizens. And the secrecy of Jekyll Island proves the sinister intent. If the plan was legitimate, why hide it? Let me give you the grounded explanation first, and then tell you what the defenders conveniently leave out. The secrecy was real and it was deliberate, but the reason was political, not sinister. Banking reform was political poison in 1910. The big Wall Street banks were deeply unpopular. Any plan associated with JP Morgan or Rockefeller interests would be attacked as a Wall Street power grab regardless of its actual merits. Senator Aldrich knew that if reporters discovered a group of Morgan and Rockefeller bankers drafting legislation, the plan would be dead before it reached Congress. So they hid. The fake names, the drawn blinds, the cover story about duck hunting, all of this was political strategy, not conspiracy. They were trying to create good policy in an environment where being associated with the authors would doom that policy. This is not unusual in politics. Good ideas often need to be distanced from unpopular sponsors. But here is what the defenders of Jekyll Island conveniently ignore. The men in that room represented approximately 1/4 of the entire world's wealth. They were designing a system that would regulate their own industry. They were writing rules that they themselves would have to follow. And surprise, those rules gave enormous power to the banking industry while creating the appearance of government oversight. The Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private member banks. Bankers would sit on the boards that made policy. The system would have the power to create money, and that money creation would flow first through the banking system before reaching the broader economy. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. The question is how you interpret it. If you believe that the men at Jekyll Island were acting in good faith, trying to solve a genuine problem with the best available expediency, then their self-interest was incidental. They happened to be bankers, the system happened to benefit banks, but the system also served the public interest by preventing panics and stabilizing the economy. If you believe that the men at Jekyll Island were acting primarily in their own interest, then the system they created was designed from the start to benefit their class at public expense. The appearance of reform was cover for a power grab. The regional structure was theatre designed to hide centralised control. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Both interpretations have evidence supporting them. The system has prevented many financial panics, and the lender of last resort function has genuinely stabilised the economy. But the system has also consistently served banking interests, and the creation of money through bank lending has transferred enormous wealth to the financial sector over the past century. You can acknowledge both realities without resolving the question of intent. What we know for certain is this: the men at Jekyll Island designed a system. That system gave them and their successors enormous power, and they did it in secret. Whether that makes them responsible reformers or self-dealing conspirators is a question history has not definitively answered. The Aldrich Plan emerged from Jekyll Island, but it did not become law. The political battle took 3 more years. Senator Aldrich presented the plan to Congress in early 1911, and it was immediately attacked from all sides. Progressives called it a Wall Street scheme. Democrats called it a Republican power grab. Populists in the South and West saw it as exactly what it was: a plan designed by Eastern bankers to consolidate their control over the nation's money. The Aldrich Plan died in Congress. But the idea did not die. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. Wilson was a Democrat, a progressive, a former academic who had written extensively about the need for banking reform. He distrusted Wall Street as much as any populist. But Wilson also understood that America genuinely needed a central banking system. The question was how to create one that served public interests rather than private ones. Wilson turned to Carter Glass, a congressman from Virginia, and William McAdoo, his Secretary of the Treasury. They took the Aldrich Plan and rewrote it, attempting to shift power from private bankers to public officials. The Central Board would be appointed by the president, not selected by bankers. Government representatives would have more power relative to banking interests. The regional structure would remain, but with stronger federal oversight. And here is where Paul Warburg performed his most remarkable feat. Despite being closely associated with the hated Aldrich Plan, Paul managed to position himself as an expert consultant to the Wilson administration. He met with Carter Glass repeatedly, offering technical advice on how to structure the system. He wrote letters and position papers. He testified before congressional committees. The plan that emerged was different from Jekyll Island in important ways, but the core architecture remained recognizable. Regional reserve banks coordinated by a central board, private ownership with public oversight, the power to create money and serve as lender of last resort. Paul Warburg had built the machine at Jekyll Island. Now he was adjusting the controls for a new political environment. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress on December 23, 1913. President Wilson signed it into law the same day. The vote was rushed through just before Christmas, when many legislators were eager to return home. Critics have pointed to this timing as evidence of manipulation. Defenders note that the bill had been debated for months, and the Christmas passage was simply when the votes finally aligned. Either interpretation, the result was the same. America had a central bank, and Paul Warburg was about to be placed at its controls. In June 1914, President Wilson nominated Paul Warburg to serve on the Federal Reserve Board. This was remarkable. The board would have only 7 members, and they would oversee the entire new system. Paul, a German-born Jewish immigrant who had been in America barely 12 years, was being asked to help run American money. His confirmation hearings were contentious. Senators questioned his loyalty. "You are German-born," they pointed out. "Your family still operates major banks in Germany. How can we trust you to put American interests first?" Paul was ready for this. "I am an American now," he declared. "I have chosen this country. I have built my life here. My loyalties are here." He was confirmed in August 1914. Within days, Germany invaded Belgium. World War I had begun. Think about the timing. The Federal Reserve System officially opened for business on November 16, 1914. World War I began on July 28, 1914. The system Paul Warburg had designed and helped implement was barely operational when the greatest conflict in human history erupted, and that conflict would become the first true test of the new system. The Federal Reserve, when created, would oversee a banking system with total assets of $27 billion, equivalent to approximately $800 billion today. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks would eventually control the money supply of the world's largest economy. Paul Warburg was one of just 7 members of the first Federal Reserve Board. The Jekyll Island participants personally represented firms controlling assets exceeding $5 billion. Within a decade, the Fed would finance American participation in World War I by helping issue $17 billion in Liberty bonds, the largest debt offering in history up to that point. The system Paul helped design would prove exactly as powerful as its critics feared. What does the Federal Reserve actually do? This matters because understanding the Fed's power explains why its creation was so controversial and why it became so central to financing war. The Fed serves as lender of last resort. When banks face temporary cash shortages, They can borrow from the Fed rather than collapsing. This prevents bank runs from spreading into system-wide panics. The Fed controls the money supply. By adjusting interest rates and buying or selling government bonds, the Fed can expand or contract the amount of money circulating in the economy. The Fed supervises member banks, setting requirements for reserves and overseeing their operations. And crucially for what came next, the Fed can help the government borrow money. When the government needs to raise funds quickly, the Fed can purchase government bonds, effectively creating money to lend to the government. This power would prove decisive in war. Before the Fed, the government had limited ability to borrow. Wars had to be financed through taxes or by convincing private investors to buy bonds. This constrained military spending. After the Fed, the government could borrow almost unlimited amounts because the Fed could always create the money needed to buy government bonds. The lender of last resort had become the lender of unlimited resort. This is why the timing matters. The Fed was created in 1913. War began in 1914. America entered the war in 1917. And the Fed financed that entry by enabling the government to borrow $17 billion in just 18 months. Without the Fed, that level of borrowing would have been impossible. Without that borrowing, America's military contribution would have been far smaller. The system Paul Warburg designed made American intervention in World War I financially possible. Whether he intended this or foresaw it, we cannot know, but the connection between the Fed and the war is not conspiracy theory. It is documented monetary history. Paul Warburg had just helped create the most powerful financial institution in America. Within months, his brother Max would be using German banks to finance a war against the very countries Paul had made possible. The Warburg family was about to face an impossible choice. Germany or America? Blood or country? Chapter 5. Brothers at War. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Paul Warburg was in New York, Max Warburg was in Hamburg, and their money was about to flow to both sides of the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. The cascade of war declarations that August happened so fast that most people could not comprehend what was unfolding. Austria declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. Within 1 week, the major powers of Europe had committed themselves to a conflict that would kill 17 million people. And in the middle of this catastrophe stood two brothers from the same family, the same blood, the same banking tradition, now financing opposite sides of industrial slaughter. Max Warburg's response was immediate and total. He was a German patriot to his core. Remember what he always said, "I am a German of Jewish faith, not a Jewish German." When the Kaiser called, Max answered without hesitation. Within days of war being declared, he was meeting with German government officials, offering the full resources of Warburg and Company to the war effort. His reasoning was simple. Germany would win, Germany must win, and every German institution must contribute to that victory. The role Max assumed was extraordinary, and he became essentially the private banker to the German war machine. This was not an official government position, but something more powerful. A trusted advisor who could move between the worlds of private finance and state necessity. The German government needed money, vast amounts of money, more money than existed in the German treasury. The army needed weapons, ammunition, food, uniforms, vehicles, medical supplies, and all of it had to be paid for somehow. The answer was war bonds. Germany would borrow from its own citizens, promising to repay after victory with the spoils of conquest. Max Warburg helped design these bond issues. He helped place them with wealthy German investors. He used his international connections to try to maintain German credit abroad. He believed completely that he was serving his country in its hour of greatest need. What makes this so complicated is that Max was genuinely convinced of German righteousness. He was not cynically profiting from war. He believed Germany was fighting a defensive war against encirclement by jealous enemies. He believed German culture and German industry and German science represented the highest achievements of civilization. He believed victory would bring a better world. This was not unique to Max. Millions of Germans believed exactly the same thing. But Max was not just any German. He was one of the most powerful bankers in Europe with brothers in enemy nations, and while he was pledging his fortune to German victory, his brother Paul was sitting in New York facing an impossible nightmare. Paul Warburg in August 1914 was a member of the Federal Reserve Board. He had helped create the most important financial institution in America. He had been confirmed by the United States Senate. He was technically an American citizen, having naturalized in 1911, but he had been born in Hamburg. He spoke with a German accent. His brother was literally financing the German army, and now he had to navigate a situation where any wrong step could destroy everything he had built. America in August 1914 declared neutrality. President Wilson asked Americans to be impartial in thought as well as action. But true neutrality was impossible. American banks were doing business with all the warring nations. American companies were selling supplies to whoever could pay. And the Allies, particularly Britain and France, had massive established trade relationships with America, while Germany was increasingly cut off by the British naval blockade. Paul's public statements during this period were masterpieces of careful nothing. He spoke about financial stability, about the Federal Reserve's role in maintaining American economic strength, about the need for calm in turbulent times. He said nothing about the war itself. He expressed no opinion about which side was right. He was scrupulously, painfully, obviously neutral. But his private correspondence tells a different story. Letters to family members reveal a man torn apart by divided loyalties. He loved Germany. He had grown up there, his brother was there. His childhood memories, his cultural formation, his sense of who he was as a person, all of it was German. But he had chosen America. He had committed to building a life in New York. His children were American. His future was American. And now those two identities were at war with each other literally. The accusations started almost immediately. Newspapers began questioning whether Paul Warburg could be trusted. He was German-born. His brother was a German banker. How could he possibly serve American interests when his family was profiting from the German war effort? These accusations were amplified by genuine xenophobia and by anti-Semitism that was never far below the surface of American public life. The Jewish banker with foreign loyalties became a convenient target for those who suspected dark conspiracies behind the war. Paul defended himself carefully. He pointed to his American citizenship. He pointed to his service on the Federal Reserve Board. He pointed to his children who were entirely American in their upbringing. But he could not point to any break with his German family because there was none. He continued to correspond with Max. He continued to maintain family connections. He could not bring himself to renounce his brother, even when that brother was financing armies that might someday fight American soldiers. What nobody talked about publicly, but everybody understood privately, was that the money was flowing everywhere. This is what most people do not understand about international banking during World War I. The financial system did not split cleanly along national lines. The same banks, the same networks, the same correspondent relationships that had moved money around the world before the war continued to function during the war. Just with more complexity and more secrecy. German banks financed German munitions factories. Obviously. The Krupp works needed capital to produce artillery shells. The German shipyards needed loans to build submarines. The German army needed credit to purchase supplies from neutral countries. Warburg and Company helped arrange all of this. They placed war bonds. They extended credit to war industries. They maintained what international connections they could despite the British blockade. American banks financed Allied purchases. This was equally obvious. Britain and France needed American wheat, American cotton, American steel, American weapons. They paid for these purchases with gold at first, then with loans from American banks. JP Morgan and Company became the primary purchasing agent for the British government, handling billions of dollars in transactions. Kuhnloeb and Company, where Paul's brother Felix was still a partner, participated in Allied bond issues. Think about what this means. Kuhnloeb was connected to the Warburgs by blood and marriage. Paul Warburg had been a partner there before joining the Federal Reserve. Felix Warburg was still there. And Kuhnloeb was helping finance the Allied war effort, while the family bank in Hamburg was helping finance the German war effort. The same family, different sides of the same war, both making money. The conspiracy theorists love this fact. They point to it as proof that the Warburgs deliberately engineered the war for profit, playing both sides to maximize financial gain regardless of how many people died. The international bankers wanted war, the theory goes, because war meant debt and debt meant interest payments, and interest payments meant profits forever. This makes for a compelling narrative, but the documented reality is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. There is no evidence that the Warburgs coordinated their activities to prolong the war or maximize profits. Max genuinely believed in German victory. He was not hoping for a long war. He wanted Germany to win quickly and decisively. Paul was genuinely anguished by the conflict. His letters show a man in psychological torment, not a man counting profits. The brothers were not talking strategy about how to exploit the situation. They were barely talking at all as the war made communication increasingly difficult and dangerous. But here is what the defenders of the Warburgs do not adequately address. The structure of international banking meant that families like the Warburgs were positioned to benefit from conflict regardless of their personal intentions. Their networks spanned national boundaries. Their expertise was needed by all governments. Their neutrality, real or perceived, made them valuable intermediaries. Whether they wanted to profit from war or not, the system they had built and operated was designed to profit from exactly these situations. The question is not really whether the Warburgs conspired to cause or prolong World War I. There is no evidence they did. The question is whether the system of international private banking creates incentives that make war more likely and more profitable regardless of any individual banker's intentions. And that question has never been satisfactorily answered. The scale of what was being financed is almost impossible to comprehend. World War I cost the belligerent nations approximately $208 billion in direct military costs. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $5 trillion in today's money. Germany alone spent 50 billion marks exhausting its treasury and requiring massive bond issues that M.M. Warburg helped place. Britain spent approximately £9 billion. France spent approximately 140 billion francs. Russia spent until it collapsed into revolution. And on the other side of the Atlantic, American banks loaned over $10 billion to the Allied powers before America even entered the war. Kuhn-Loeb participated in these loans. The Warburg Connected Bank was helping finance the enemies of the country where the Warburg family bank was headquartered. The money flows were staggering and they were interconnected in ways that made clean moral judgments impossible. By war's end, an estimated 10 million soldiers and 7 million civilians were dead. The Warburg family directly participated in financing perhaps 15 to 20% of the German war effort through their banking operations. The war bonds they helped sell funded the weapons that killed millions. Whether this makes them responsible or simply makes them bankers doing what bankers do is a question history has not answered. Every arms manufacturer, every steel company, every farmer who sold wheat to the armies could make the same defense. We did not start the war. We simply provided what was demanded. The Warburgs were just more efficient at it than most. The family information network is another uncomfortable topic. Before the war, the Warburg brothers had shared information freely across their international operations. That was the whole point of having family members in different financial centres. What someone learned in Hamburg could benefit operations in New York and vice versa. When war came, did this information sharing stop? Officially, yes. The brothers were citizens of enemy nations. Sharing strategic information would be espionage. But family letters continued to flow through neutral countries. Personal news was exchanged. And where does personal news end and strategic information begin? If Max mentioned in a family letter that German morale was high and the spring offensive was being prepared with confidence, was that espionage? If Paul responded with observations about American public opinion shifting toward intervention, was that treason? The historical record is incomplete. Many letters were destroyed. What survives is carefully edited for posterity. We cannot know with certainty what information crossed between the brothers. We can only note that the channels existed and that both sides of the war desperately wanted the kind of intelligence that international bankers naturally possessed. Then came May 17 and everything changed. The Zimmermann telegram revealed that Germany was trying to convince Mexico to attack the United States. German submarines were sinking American ships without warning. American public opinion swung decisively toward war. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Paul Warburg now faced the moment he had dreaded for 3 years. His adopted country was at war with his native country. His brother was the enemy. There was no more neutrality possible. Paul had to choose. His public response was unequivocal. He was American. He supported the American war effort. He bought Liberty bonds. He made patriotic statements. But privately, the anguish intensified. He was now financing the war against his brother. The Federal Reserve, over which he had authority, was helping fund armies that would kill German soldiers. His own expertise in international banking was being used against the country where he was born. The accusations against Paul grew fiercer after American entry. Now he was not just suspected of divided loyalties, he was actively accused of being a German agent. Congressmen questioned whether a German-born banker should be allowed to serve on the Federal Reserve Board during wartime. Newspapers published insinuations about his loyalty. The anti-Semitic undertones became overtones. The Jewish German banker became a target. In August 1918, Paul Warburg resigned from the Federal Reserve Board. Officially, this was because his term was expiring and he did not wish to seek reappointment during wartime controversy. Unofficially, he was exhausted by the accusations and understood that his continued presence was becoming a political liability. The system he had helped create would continue without him. Meanwhile, his son James Warburg had enlisted in the United States Navy. Think about that. Paul's son was serving in the military of a country at war with Paul's brother. James was willing to fight and potentially die against the nation where his father was born and where his uncle was a leading banker. The family was literally divided by the trenches. Max in Hamburg continued to serve the German war effort until the bitter end. Even as Germany began to collapse in late 1918, even as revolution spread through German cities, even as the Kaiser fled to Holland, Max remained at his post. He helped manage the financial chaos of defeat. He tried to maintain some stability for German industry and German workers. He believed he was serving his country even in its hour of destruction. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, the Warburg brothers had survived on opposite sides of the greatest catastrophe in human history. They had financed different armies. They had served different governments. They had maintained their family bonds through it all despite everything. And now Germany was defeated, humiliated, facing demands from the victorious Allies that would reshape the world. Max Warburg would be asked to help negotiate the peace. He would be asked to sign a treaty that he knew would lead to future disaster. And the choices he made at Versailles would haunt not just his family, but the entire world for a generation. When the war ended, 17 million were dead. Germany was broken. The old empires of Europe had collapsed, and the Warburg family had made money from both sides. Not through conspiracy, not through deliberate coordination, but through the simple fact that international banking families are positioned to profit from conflict by the very structure of how the international finance works. The question everyone asks is whether the Warburgs were villains who prolonged the war for profit, or victims who were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The honest answer is that they were neither and both. They were bankers who did what bankers do. They financed whoever needed financing. They maintained their networks, they served their governments, they protected their family, and millions of people died while the money kept flowing. Whether that makes them guilty or innocent depends entirely on whether you believe the system itself is guilty, and that is a question that leads to Versailles and beyond. Chapter 6. The Versailles Betrayal. Max Warburg was one of 6 German delegates at Versailles. He knew the treaty's terms would destroy Germany. He signed anyway, and he spent the rest of his life asking himself if he had made the worst mistake in history. November 1918. The guns finally fell scant after 4 years of slaughter that had consumed 17 million lives. Germany had not been invaded. German troops still occupied foreign territory, yet somehow Germany had lost. The Kaiser fled to Holland. Revolution erupted in Berlin. Sailors mutinied. Soldiers deserted. The proud German empire that Max Warburg had served his entire adult life collapsed in a matter of weeks. And then came the summons. The new German government needed financial experts for the peace negotiations. They needed someone who understood international banking, who had relationships with allied financial institutions, who could perhaps negotiate reasonable terms. They needed Max Warburg. He did not want to go. Max understood what awaited the German delegation at Versailles. This would not be a negotiation between equals. This would be a dictation. The Allied powers had spent 4 years demonizing Germany as uniquely evil, as the sole aggressor, as a nation that deserved punishment. They were not interested in a fair peace. They wanted revenge, and they wanted money. Max travelled to Versailles in May 1919 as part of a delegation that included Foreign Minister Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau and a handful of other officials and experts. The journey itself was humiliating. The German delegates were transported in sealed trains, forbidden from speaking with French citizens, treated like prisoners rather than diplomats. When they arrived at Versailles, they were housed in a hotel surrounded by barbed wire. French soldiers guarded every exit. The Germans were not permitted to wander the grounds, not permitted to mingle with Allied delegates, not permitted to do anything except wait for their sentence to be pronounced. The Allied terms arrived on May 7th, 1919. Max read them with the growing horror. Reparations of 132 billion gold marks. Germany would be paying for this war until 1988. nearly 70 years into the future, every German citizen, including children not yet born, would carry this debt. The war guilt clause required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, even though the assassination that triggered the conflict happened in Austria, even though Russia mobilized first, even though the alliance system that turned a regional dispute into a world war involved every major power. Germany alone would bear the blame, territory. Germany would lose 13% of its land and 10% of its population. Alsace and Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor splitting Germany in two, the Saar coalfields under international control, all German colonies seized, the military. Germany could maintain only 100,000 soldiers, no tanks, no aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery. The nation that had fielded the most powerful army in Europe would be reduced to a police force. Max immediately began drafting objections. He argued that the reparations were impossible. Germany simply could not pay 132 billion gold marks. The amount exceeded the entire value of German property. Attempting to extract such sums would collapse the German economy, which would in turn collapse the European economy, which would in turn drag down the entire world. He warned that the terms would create another war. A generation of Germans would grow up hungry, humiliated, and seeking revenge. The peace being dictated at Versailles was not a peace at all, but merely a long armistice before the next catastrophe. Nobody listened. The French wanted Germany crushed. They had lost 1.4 million soldiers and seen their northeastern provinces devastated. They wanted guarantees that Germany could never threaten them again. The British wanted German colonies and German shipping eliminated as competition. They wanted the German navy at the bottom of the ocean, which is exactly where it ended up when German sailors scuttled their own fleet rather than surrender it. The Americans, despite President Wilson's lofty rhetoric about self-determination and fair peace, ultimately went along with their allies. Max sent his assessments to Berlin. He pleaded with the German delegation to reject the terms, to refuse to sign, to make the Allies invade, and reveal to the world that this was conquest, not peace. But what was the alternative? Germany had no army left capable of resistance. The Allied blockade was still in place. German wives and children were starving. Every week of delay meant more deaths. The German government agonized for weeks. On June 16th, the Allies delivered an ultimatum. Sign within 7 days or the war resumes. On June 26th, the German National Assembly voted to accept the terms. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the German delegation signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. Max Warburg's signature appeared on the economic sections. He later wrote that he signed knowing it would lead to catastrophe, but seeing no other choice. Years later, he would tell his family that the moment he put pen to paper was the worst moment of his life. He had just helped condemn his country to humiliation and his people to suffering. And he had given ammunition to every anti-Semite in Germany. The stab in the back myth was already forming even as the ink dried at Versailles. German nationalists refused to accept that their army had been defeated. The soldiers had been winning, they claimed. Germany had been betrayed by enemies within: Jews, socialists, war profiteers, the November criminals who had surrendered when victory was still possible. And now look who had signed the hated treaty. Look at the names: Max Warburg, a Jewish banker. The conspiracy theories wrote themselves. Here is what conspiracy theorists claim. Jewish bankers like Max Warburg deliberately engineered harsh peace terms to profit from German suffering. They wanted Germany weakened so they could swoop in and buy assets cheaply. They wanted chaos so they could charge massive fees for stabilization loans. They wanted a vindictive peace because a just peace would not create the financial opportunities they craved. The documented history shows something different but still deeply uncomfortable. Max actively argued against the harshest terms. His letters and memoranda from Versailles repeatedly warned that the reparations were unpayable and would lead to disaster. He was a prophet whose prophecy was ignored. But here is the uncomfortable truth that complicates the narrative. Warburg banks did profit from the post-war chaos. When the German mark collapsed into hyperinflation, someone had to help stabilize the currency. When German industries needed to restructure, someone had to arrange the financing. When the Dawes Plan reorganized German debt payments in 1924, American banks, including the Warburg-connected Kuhn-Loeb, earned substantial fees. Did Max sign knowing that the chaos to come would ultimately benefit his family's financial interests? His anguished writings suggest genuine horror at what was happening, genuine patriotic grief for his country. But those same writings also discuss business opportunities with clinical precision. Whether Max was a prophet ignored or a banker positioning for profit is a question his own conflicted soul never fully resolved. The aftermath was exactly as Max had predicted. Germany tried to pay. Germany could not pay. By 1921, Germany defaulted on reparations payments. France responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers went on strike. The German government printed money to pay them. And then came hyperinflation. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. In January 21, $1 equaled approximately 65 German marks. By November 1923, $1 equaled 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every 3.7 days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January in 23 cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers were paid twice daily because money became worthless by afternoon. People wallpapered their homes with currency because banknotes were cheaper than wallpaper. Lifetime savings became worthless overnight. A German who had diligently saved 100,000 marks before the war, enough to live comfortably for decades, found that amount, would not buy a single postage stamp. The Treaty of Versailles demanded 32 billion gold marks in reparations, approximately $400 billion in today's money. Germany would pay until 1988, under the original terms. During hyperinflation in 1923, prices doubled every 3.7 days. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. The Warburg Bank's pre-war assets of 150 million marks became effectively worthless. Yet through currency speculation and international connections, the Warburgs recovered within years while ordinary Germans lost everything. By 1928, Warburg was again one of Germany's most important banks, and Max was again advising the German government. The family had survived another catastrophe, but the next one would be different. Max threw himself into stabilization efforts. He helped negotiate the Dawes Plan in 1924, which restructured German debt payments and brought American loans flooding into Germany. The economy stabilized. The mark was replaced by the Rentenmark, then the Reichsmark. Industry recovered. The mid-20s brought a brief golden age, the Weimar Renaissance of art and culture and apparent prosperity. But the prosperity was built on borrowed money. American banks, including institutions with Warburg connections, lent billions to Germany. Germany used those loans to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those reparations to repay their war debts to America. The money flowed in a circle, with bankers taking fees at every step. When the American stock market crashed in 1929 and American banks called in their German loans, the entire structure collapsed. But before that collapse came, something even more dangerous was growing. Anti-Semitism had always existed in Germany, but the combination of war defeat, Versailles humiliation, hyperinflation, and conspiracy theories created something new and virulent. Jewish bankers became the explanation for everything that had gone wrong. The war, lost because Jews stabbed Germany in the back. Versailles, signed by Jewish traitors who profited from German suffering. Hyperinflation, caused by Jewish financial manipulation. Weimar decadence, Jewish cultural corruption. Every grievance, every humiliation, every economic catastrophe was laid at the feet of Jewish conspirators. Max Warburg was named specifically in Nazi propaganda. His signature on the Versailles Treaty, his role in German banking, his connections to international finance, his family's positions in American institutions. Everything that made the Warburgs successful made them targets. Max could see what was coming. His friends urged him to leave Germany while there was still time. His American relatives begged him to join them in New York. But Max refused. Germany was his country. His family had lived there for centuries. They had served German princes and German industry and the German Empire itself. He had signed the Versailles Treaty as a German patriot, trying to save his nation from worse terms. He would not abandon Germany now. Besides, Max believed the Nazi phenomenon was temporary. Germany was a civilized country. The land of Goethe and Beethoven could not possibly fall permanently under the spell of a vulgar, Austrian corporal screaming about Jewish conspiracies. The German people would come to their senses. The institutions would hold. His family's century of service to Germany would count for something. Max Warburg believed Germany would return to sanity. He believed his family's century of service would protect them. When the Nazis came to power, he would learn just how wrong he was. Chapter 7. Dancing with Devils. In 1933, Max Warburg met with Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's economic minister. He was trying to save German Jews. He was also trying to save his bank. The Nazis were interested in both. You need to understand what January 30th, 1933 looked like from Max Warburg's perspective. He was 65 years old. He had survived the collapse of the German Empire, the chaos of revolution, the hyperinflation that destroyed the middle class, the Great Depression that shuttered thousands of businesses. His family had been banking in Germany for over a century. They had weathered 14 different rulers. They had outlasted Napoleon. Surely they could outlast this Austrian corporal with his ridiculous moustache and his gang of street thugs. That was Max's calculation. This cannot last. The German people are too civilized. The army will never tolerate this. The industrialists will pull their support. Give it 6 months, maybe a year, and this madness will burn itself out. Max was not alone in this delusion. Most of Germany's Jewish elite believed the same thing. They were Germans first, they told themselves. Their families had fought in the Great War. They had built German industry, German culture, German finance. Surely that counted for something. Surely the Nazis understood that destroying Jewish businesses meant destroying German prosperity. Max had connections. He knew people in the government, in industry, in the military. He would use those connections to moderate the regime, to protect his people, to wait out the storm. What Max did not understand, what almost nobody understood in those early months, was that the Nazis did not operate by the rules of rational self-interest. They were not politicians who could be negotiated with, bribed, reasoned into moderation. They were ideologues pursuing a vision of racial purity that had no room for compromise. But Max tried anyway. Within weeks of Hitler taking power, Max was meeting with Nazi officials, not to collaborate, not to support their program, but to negotiate, to find some arrangement that would allow German Jews to survive. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult, because what Max helped negotiate was the Haavara Agreement of 1933, one of the most controversial arrangements in Jewish history. The deal worked like this. German Jews who wanted to emigrate to Palestine could deposit their money in a special account in Germany. That money would be used to purchase German goods. Those goods would be shipped to Palestine and sold. The proceeds, minus significant fees, would be waiting for the emigrants when they arrived. The Nazis got something they wanted: Jewish emigration plus continued German exports despite an international boycott. The Zionist movement got something they wanted: Jewish immigration to Palestine plus capital to build the future state of Israel. And German Jews got something they needed: a way out with at least some of their wealth intact. Max Warburg helped design the financial mechanisms. His bank processed transactions. His connections on both sides made the agreement possible. And here's the question that has haunted historians ever since. Was this heroic pragmatism or collaboration with murderers? Think about the numbers. The Haavara Agreement enabled approximately 60,000 German Jews to emigrate to Palestine between 1933 and 1939. They brought with them roughly 100 million Reichsmarks in assets, approximately $2 billion in today's money. This capital helped establish the economic foundation of what would become Israel. Without Haavara, tens of thousands more Jews might have died in the Holocaust. The agreement saved lives. But the agreement also helped the Nazi regime. It broke the international Jewish boycott of German goods. It provided foreign currency that Germany desperately needed. It gave the Nazis a tool to encourage Jewish emigration while enriching the state through confiscatory fees. It normalized economic relations with a regime that was already persecuting its Jewish citizens. Max Warburg helped make that normalization possible. Now, some people have tried to make this story simpler than it actually was. Conspiracy theorists claim the Warburgs secretly funded Hitler's rise to power, seeking to profit from another war just as they had profited from the first one. There is no credible evidence for this claim. None. The documented history shows Max desperately trying to navigate an impossible situation, not orchestrating it. He was not funding the Nazis. He was trying to survive them. But here is what the defenders of Max's legacy sometimes gloss over. Warburg and Company continued operating in Nazi Germany until 1938. For 5 years after Hitler took power, for 3 years after the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship, the bank processed international transactions, it maintained foreign relationships. It provided a veneer of normalcy to a murderous regime. Every day that the Warburg Bank operated was a day that the Nazi economy functioned slightly better. Every transaction they processed contributed, however marginally, to to a regime that was building concentration camps and drafting laws to destroy Jewish life in Europe. Was this pragmatic survival or moral compromise? The honest answer is that in Nazi Germany, the line between those two things was often invisible. Max stayed because leaving meant abandoning his employees, the Jewish workers who depended on the bank for their livelihoods, for their protection, for their eventual emigration. He stayed because he believed, foolishly as it turned out, that he could influence events from inside. He stayed because Germany was his home, his identity, his family's legacy for 5 generations. And he stayed because he could not accept that the country he loved had become something monstrous. Meanwhile, Max was facing pressure from the other direction. His brother Felix in New York was watching Germany descend into darkness with growing horror. Felix had become one of America's most generous philanthropists, donating millions to Jewish causes, to hospitals, to cultural institutions. Now he threw himself into refugee relief work. Felix helped establish the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, which would become the most important Jewish refugee organization in the world. He raised millions of dollars to help Jews escape Europe. He lobbied the American government to relax immigration restrictions. He spoke publicly about Nazi persecution when many American Jews were still trying to avoid making waves. The contrast between the brothers was painful. Felix in New York, loudly condemning the Nazis, raising funds for refugees, pushing for American intervention. Max in Hamburg, quietly meeting with Nazi officials, processing transactions for the regime, hoping that accommodation would save more lives than confrontation. They argued about it in letters and in rare face-to-face meetings. Felix believed Max was deluding himself. Max believed Felix did not understand the situation on the ground. Both were probably right. Paul Warburg's son James added another voice to the family chorus. James had grown up in America, served in the American government, and had no patience for his uncle's attempts at accommodation. He spoke out publicly against the Nazi regime. He urged American intervention. He made it clear that whatever the German Warburgs were doing, the American branch wanted no part of appeasing Hitler. This created tension within the family. Max felt abandoned by his American relatives, criticized by people who did not face the choices he faced every day. The American Warburgs felt compromised by their German cousins' continued operations in Nazi Germany. The family that had once operated as a unified network across borders was fracturing under the pressure of history. Throughout 1934, 1935, 1936, Max continued believing that things would improve, that the regime would moderate, that the worst predictions would not come true. Each year brought new horrors that he somehow rationalized or minimized, or simply refused to see clearly. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship. Max was no longer legally German after 5 generations, yet he stayed. Jewish businesses were being confiscated, Jewish professionals banned from their occupations, Jewish children expelled from schools. Yet the Warburg Bank continued operating. The Nazis were openly calling for the elimination of Jews from German life. Yet Max still believed he could negotiate. By 1937, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The bank's non-Jewish business partners were being told to sever relationships. Foreign correspondents were getting nervous about working with a Jewish firm. The Nazi authorities were making it clear that Jewish banks had no future in the new Germany. Felix died in October 1937 in New York. He never saw the worst of what was coming. In some ways, that was a mercy. Then came Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938. The night of broken glass. Nazi stormtroopers and ordinary German citizens rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods across Germany. They burned synagogues. They smashed Jewish businesses. They beat Jews in the streets. They arrested 30,000 Jewish men and sent them to concentration camps. The illusion that Max had maintained for 5 years shattered in a single night. There was no negotiating with this. There was no accommodation that would satisfy a regime that burned houses of worship and celebrated violence against civilians. There was only escape or death. Within weeks, Max was negotiating the sale of Warburg & Company. The word sale does not capture what actually happened. This was Aryanization, the Nazi term for the forced transfer of Jewish businesses to non-Jewish owners. Max had no real choice in the matter. He could sell the bank for whatever the Nazis allowed him to receive, or they would simply confiscate it. He sold to a consortium of non-Jewish German banks. The price was 2.3 million Reichsmarks. The bank that his family had built over 140 years The bank that had financed Hamburg's rise to become one of Europe's great trading cities, the bank that had advised Kaisers and governments, was sold for perhaps 10% of its actual value, maybe less. Max was also required to pay special taxes, to surrender foreign assets, to leave behind virtually everything the family had accumulated over generations. He departed Germany in 1939 with a fraction of his wealth. A man who had been one of the most powerful bankers in Europe arrived in New York as a refugee. His brother Paul had died in 1932, before the worst. Felix had died in 1937. Max found himself reunited with his American relatives, but the reunion was bitter. He had lost his country, his bank, his sense of himself as a German, his belief that civilization would ultimately triumph over barbarism, and he carried questions that would never have good answers. Could he have done more? Should he have left earlier? Did his years of accommodation make the Nazi regime stronger, or did they buy time for thousands of Jews to escape? Did working with the Nazis save lives or prolong the system that destroyed them? Here are the numbers that define Max Warburg's moral ledger, and they do not add up to a simple verdict. The Havre Agreement he helped design enabled approximately 60,000 Jews to reach Palestine. His personal interventions, his connections, his money helped perhaps another 5,000 escape through other channels. That is 65,000 people who survived because Max Warburg stayed and tried to work within the system. Meanwhile, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. The transactions his bank processed, the normalcy his continued operations provided, the time the Nazis bought through agreements like Havre, all of this marginally strengthened a regime that was building the machinery of genocide. How do you weigh 65,000 saved against the marginal contribution to 6 million dead? How do you judge a man who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances? The conspiracy theorists want Max to be a villain, a secret puppet master who funded Hitler for profit. That is not supported by any credible evidence. The defenders want Max to be a hero, a man who sacrificed everything to save his people. That ignores 5 years of accommodation with a murderous regime to... The truth is more uncomfortable than either story. Max Warburg was a man who faced choices no one should have to make and made them imperfectly. He was brave and he was foolish, he saved lives and he legitimized murderers. He loved his country and his country tried to kill his people. There is no verdict that makes sense of this. Max lived out his remaining years in New York. He never returned to Germany. He watched from across the ocean as his homeland descended into total war and then rose from the ashes as a divided nation. The bank he had lost was eventually returned to Warburg family control in 1970, decades after his death. He did not live to see that restoration. What he did live with was the memory of every compromise, every meeting with Nazi officials, every transaction processed for a regime that was building concentration camps while he was processing their international payments. The question of whether Max Warburg was a collaborator or a survivor may not have an answer, but the question itself matters, because it forces us to ask what we would have done. How long would we have stayed? What accommodations would we have made? At what point does pragmatic survival become moral complicity? Max Warburg survived the Holocaust. His family survived. Their wealth, diminished but not destroyed, survived. But what they had done to survive, the compromises, the cooperation, the years of believing that negotiation could work with pure evil, would haunt the family forever. And the question of whether the Warburgs enabled tragedy or merely survived it would follow them into history, never fully answered, never fully escapable, a permanent shadow on a family that had once believed money could buy safety from anything. Chapter 8. What History Forgot and Why. Max Warburg died in New York in 1946. He never returned to Germany. The bank his family founded in 1798 was restored to Warburg control in 70. Today, nobody remembers the name. Think about that for a moment. A family that helped create the Federal Reserve, that financed both sides of the largest war in human history, that advised Kaisers and presidents and prime ministers, that shaped the financial architecture of the modern world. Gone from public memory, erased. How does that happen? How does a dynasty that powerful simply disappear from the history books? The answer tells us something profound about how power actually works. When Max arrived in New York in 1939, he was a broken man. Everything he had built in Germany was gone. The bank his grandfather had founded, sold for a fraction of its value to satisfy Nazi demands for Aryanization. His country, the Germany he'd served with absolute devotion, had turned on him simply because of his blood. His brothers Paul and Felix were dead. The world he had known was burning, and he had played a role, however unwilling, in creating the conditions that led to the fire. Max lived his final years in quiet obscurity. He wrote memoirs that were never published in his lifetime. He attended synagogue. He watched from afar as the war he had predicted at Versailles consumed Europe exactly as he had warned. When Germany surrendered in 1945, Max was 78 years old. He could have returned. The Allies were looking for Germans untainted by Nazi collaboration, Germans who could help rebuild. Max Warburg, with his international connections and financial expertise, would have been invaluable. He chose to stay in New York. Some historians say he was too old, too tired. Others suggest he could not bear to see what Germany had become. But there is another possibility. Perhaps Max understood that returning would mean answering questions. Questions about his years of cooperation with the Nazi regime. Questions about why he stayed so long. Questions about the transactions his bank had processed, while Jews were being stripped of citizenship and rights and ultimately lives. The Warburgs who survived chose a different path. They chose silence. Erich Warburg, Max's son, did eventually return to Germany. He served in the US Army during the war, fighting against the country his father had devoted his life to serving. After the war, Erich worked to restore the family bank. In 1970, Warburg & Company was officially returned to Warburg control, but it was never the same. The bank that had once advised the Kaiser and financed empires became a modest regional institution, important in Hamburg, unknown globally. Erich and his generation made a conscious decision. They would not seek the spotlight. They would not remind the world of the Warburg name. They would not invite the questions that prominence would bring. This was partly survivor's guilt. How do you explain that your family escaped when 6 million did not? How do you celebrate your heritage when that heritage was used as justification for genocide? How do you claim the legacy of power when that power could not save your own people? But it was also calculation. The post-war world was different. The kind of international family banking network the Warburgs had built, with brothers in competing nations and loyalty to blood over flag, was no longer acceptable. The world had seen where such arrangements could lead. National governments were suspicious of international finance in ways they had not been before Versailles. Being visible meant being vulnerable. So the Warburgs faded. They maintained their wealth, they supported their charities, they preserved their cultural institutions. The Warburg Institute, founded by Abby Warburg before the First War, still operates in London as one of the world's premier centres for art historical research. The Joint Distribution Committee, which the American Warburgs helped establish and fund, continues to provide humanitarian assistance to Jewish communities worldwide. The family's impact continues, but the name has vanished from the commanding heights of finance. You will not find Warburg on any major bank today. You will not find Warburgs advising presidents or prime ministers. You will not find the family seal on documents that decide the fate of nations. They chose invisibility, and in that invisibility, they found something else. They found the conspiracy theorists. Here is the strange irony of the Warburg story. The family that deliberately retreated from public life became the subject of endless public speculation. The less visible they became, the more sinister they appeared. Into the vacuum of actual information rushed fantasy. It started almost immediately after the war. In 1952, a man named Eustace Mullins published a book called Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Mullins had been a protege of the poet Ezra Pound, who was then confined to a mental institution after being charged with treason for his pro-fascist broadcast during the war. Mullins claimed that the Federal Reserve was a conspiracy of international bankers, chief among them the Warburgs, designed to enslave the American people through debt. The book was poorly sourced, filled with errors, and animated by obvious anti-Semitism. It was also enormously influential. Mullins portrayed the Jekyll Island meeting as proof of a secret plot. He exaggerated Paul Warburg's role, transforming him from one participant among several into the mastermind of the entire scheme. He connected the Warburgs to the Rothschilds, to the Illuminati, to every conspiracy theory that had ever attached itself to Jewish bankers. And because the Warburgs were not visible to contradict him, his version spread. This is how conspiracy theories work. They require a grain of truth. The Warburgs really were at Jekyll Island. Paul Warburg really did help design the Federal Reserve. Max Warburg really did finance the German war effort while his brother sat on the American Central Bank Board. The brothers really did maintain family connections across enemy lines during a world war. All of this is documented. All of this is true. The conspiracy theorist takes these truths and builds a fantasy upon them. In the fantasy, every coincidence becomes coordination. Every family connection becomes proof of secret control. Every profit becomes evidence of planned exploitation. The mundane reality of international banking, where money flows to opportunity regardless of borders or morality, becomes a sinister plot for world domination. But here is what the conspiracy theorists miss, and what the defenders of the Warburgs also miss. The reality is disturbing enough without the fantasy. You do not need to believe in secret cabals to be troubled by what the Warburgs represent. Consider what is actually documented, what no serious historian disputes. The Warburgs helped create the financial system that made World War I possible. Without the ability to rapidly expand credit, without international banking networks that could move money across borders, without bond markets that could fund years of industrial slaughter, the war could not have been sustained. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo would have remained a regional conflict. Instead, 17 million died. The Warburgs did not cause the war. They did not want the war. Max Warburg genuinely believed Germany would win quickly and civilization would continue. Paul Warburg was horrified by the conflict. But the system they helped build, the system they perfected, enabled the war's unprecedented scale. And they profited from it. Both sides borrowed from banks connected to the Warburg network. Both sides paid interest. When the war ended, the bankers collected. Consider Versailles. Max Warburg knew the treaty terms would lead to catastrophe. He said so at the time. He warned that Germany could not pay the reparations, that the humiliation would breed resentment, that another war would follow. He was right about all of it. And he signed anyway, and his banks then participated in the loans that kept the broken system functioning, extracting fees and interest while the German economy collapsed, and ordinary Germans saw their savings become worthless. When Hitler rose on a wave of resentment against Versailles, against the bankers who had profited while Germany suffered, Max Warburg was shocked. He should not have been. Consider the Nazi years. Max stayed in Germany until 1938. For 5 years after Hitler took power, Warburg continued operating. It processed transactions, it maintained international relationships, it provided a veneer of normalcy to a regime that was openly persecuting Jews. Max told himself he was protecting his employees, enabling emigration, maintaining influence from inside. Perhaps he was. The Hasvarar Agreement, which he helped negotiate, enabled 60,000 Jews to escape to Palestine. But he was also undeniably collaborating. His bank's continued operation served Nazi interests. His presence legitimized a regime that would murder 6 million of his people. Was he a hero who saved thousands, or a collaborator who enabled evil? The question has no clean answer. This is what the conspiracy theorists cannot accept and what the defenders cannot acknowledge. The system did not require secret coordination to produce monstrous outcomes. It required only people following incentives. Bankers financed whoever would pay because that is what bankers do. Families maintained connections across borders because blood was thicker than national loyalty. Money flowed to both sides of conflicts because money has no conscience. Profits were extracted from human misery because profits were there to be extracted. The Warburgs were not puppeteers controlling the world from behind a curtain. They were products of a system that rewarded exactly their behavior. The system incentivized crossing borders, maintaining connections, financing all sides, extracting value regardless of consequences. The Warburgs simply did what the system encouraged, more successfully than almost anyone else. Which is more frightening? A secret cabal of evil geniuses manipulating history? Or a system so structured that ordinary self-interest produces catastrophic outcomes without anyone needing to plan them? The conspiracy theory is actually comforting. It suggests that someone is in control, that there is a plan, that if we could just expose and remove the conspirators, things would be better. The reality is terrifying. No one is in control. The system operates according to its own logic. The outcomes emerge from millions of individual decisions, each rational in its own context, collectively producing madness. The Warburg family legacy by the numbers: 221 years of continuous banking from 1798 to 2010, 2 founding members of the Federal Reserve Board. An estimated $50 billion in assets financed or managed across their various operations. direct participation in financing 3 major wars, establishment of cultural institutions worth billions, institutions that continue educating and preserving knowledge today, rescue of an estimated 70,000 Jews from Nazi Europe through various emigration schemes, 6 family members who died in the Holocaust despite the family's prominence and connections, despite their money, despite their relationships with the powerful, the system still killed them. And today the Warburg name appears on precisely 0 major financial institutions. The family that helped create modern banking has been almost entirely forgotten. Whether this represents historical amnesia, deliberate erasure, or simply the natural fading of all dynasties depends on what you believe about who writes history. Let me leave you with this. The Warburgs were not monsters. Reading Max's letters, his anguish is genuine. He loved Germany. He loved his family. He wanted to do right. He was trapped by the circumstances he helped create, forced into choices where every option was terrible. Unable to escape the system he had spent his life perfecting, he was not evil, he was human, and that is so much worse, because if the Warburgs were evil geniuses, we could identify and stop people like them. But if they were just humans responding to incentives, just families prioritizing blood over a nation, just bankers doing what bankers do, then the problem is not the Warburgs. The problem is the system that created them and will create their successors and is creating them right now. The Warburgs did not control the world, but they helped build the system that does. They did not start World War I, but they financed it. They did not create the Federal Reserve as a conspiracy, but they designed it in secret. They did not save the Jews of Europe, but they saved more than most. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were bankers, and that might be the most terrifying thing of all, because bankers do not need conspiracies. They just need the system to work the way it always has. Money to power, power to money, profit from every side of every conflict. The Warburgs did not invent this system. They just perfected it. And when you look at the world today, at the wars that never seem to end, at the debt that crushes nations, at the invisible flows of money that decide which countries rise and which fall, at the families whose names you will never know, making decisions that shape your life, ask yourself this: did anything really change, or did the Warburgs simply show us what was always true? Their seal was a ship on waves, tossed by circumstances, but never sinking, always surviving, always adapting, always profiting from the storm. Look around at the world they helped build. The ship is still sailing, the waves are still rising, and somewhere, in offices you will never see, in meetings you will never hear about, in transactions that cross borders without passports, the heirs to the Warburg legacy are still at work. They have different names now, they keep lower profiles. They learned from what happened to the families who became too visible. But the system remains, the incentives remain, the money still flows to wherever power resides, and power still flows to wherever money gathers. That is the real Warburg legacy, not a conspiracy, something worse, a machine that runs itself, that requires no conspirators, that produces catastrophe as naturally as it produces profit, that will continue operating long after we have forgotten the names of the families who built it. The Warburgs showed us the machine. They did not apologize for building it. They simply used it until it threatened to consume them, and then they stepped aside and let others take the controls. The question is not whether there was a Warburg conspiracy. The question is whether it matters. When the system produces the same outcomes, whether anyone is coordinating or not, when money flows to war and profit flows from suffering regardless of who sits in the banking houses, when every generation produces new families who rise to prominence by mastering the same techniques the Warburgs mastered a century ago, does it change anything to know their names? Max Warburg went to his grave believing he had served his country and his family honourably. He had done what the system demanded. He had played by the rules. That the rules produced world wars and genocide was not, in his mind, his fault. He was just a banker. The gravestone tells you nothing. There is no accounting there for the 17 million dead in the First War, the 60 million in the Second, the economic chaos between them that he helped create and profit from. There is just a name and dates and silence. The Warburgs wanted to be forgotten. They got their wish. But the world they helped build remembers them whether it knows their name or not. Every time a bank finances a war, every time money crosses a border to escape accountability, every time a family's loyalty to itself outweighs its loyalty to any national principle, every time the system produces outcomes that no individual chose, but everyone enabled, that is the Warburg legacy, and it is still with us. it will always be with us, because the Warburgs did not create human nature, they just showed us what it looks like when human nature has access to unlimited capital and no accountability. The ship on waves, still sailing, still surviving, still riding the storms it helped create. Look around. You are living in the world the Warburgs built. Welcome aboard.